Shakespeare. In the days of our earlier history, our commerce led us to have more intercourse with Flanders than with France. That which journeyed slowly and doubtfully from Paris came in all the heat of a first impression from the Low Countries. A train had been laid before, which now took light and blazed through the kingdom. The Duchess of Burgundy's reception of the Duke of York, the honors rendered him at her court, the glad gathering together of the fugitive English, gave pledge of his truth and promise of glorious results. Sedition began to spring up in England on every side, even as, after a mild rain in the birth of the year, a black, ploughed field is suddenly verdant with the young blades of wheat. All who had, since the battles of Bosworth and of Stoke, lived in seclusion or fear, all who from whatever reason had taken sanctuary, men of ruined fortunes, who desired to escape bondage, came singly or in small companies to the coast, embarked for the continent, and hastened to the court of the Dowager of Burgundy. All discontented men, who felt themselves looked coldly on by Tudor, to whom they had yielded the throne of their native land. Many, whom it grieved and vexed to see the world stagnate in changeless peace, desirous of novelty and glad of any pretense that called them into activity, dashed headlong into revolt. Nor were there few, chiefly indeed among the nobility, who had lamented the fall of the House of York, and hailed gladly this promise of its resuscitation. The common adventurers and soldiers of fortune acted on their single separate resolves. The noble adherents of the White Rose drew together, that there might be plan and strength in their schemes. They were cautious, for their enemy was crafty and powerful. They were resolute, for they hated him. Out far in the low flats bordering the River Lee, there stood, in a marshy hollow, a straggling village, now effaced from the landscape. At its extremity was a solid but gloomy square brick house, surrounded by a moat, which the low watery soil easily filled, even to overflow, and the superfluity was received in a deep stagnant pool at the back of the mansion. The damp atmosphere had darkened the structure, and thrown a mantle of green moss and speckled lichen over the bricks. Its fantastically carved and heavy portal yawned like a black cavern's mouth, and added to the singularly desolate appearance of the mansion. The village was but half inhabited, and looked as struck by poverty and discomfort. The house belonged to the Clifford family. It had been built, it was said, in Henry V's time, when Sir Roger Clifford, a stern old man, following his sovereign to the wars, shut up here his beautiful young wife, so to ensure her fidelity during his absence. Among her peers and gentle companions, the Lady Clifford had doubtless been true to the bond that linked her to her lord. But alone in this solitary mansion, surrounded by ill-natured peasants, pining for her father's pleasant halls, and her girlish enjoyments, no wonder that she found her state intolerable. Age and jealousy are ill mates for youth and sprightliness, and suspicion easily begets that which it abhors even to imagine. One who had loved her in her virgin days introduced himself into her suite. The brief months of stolen happiness passed by, and the green stagnant pool was, they said, the cold sepulchre of the betrayed lovers. Since then, during the wars of York and Lancaster, this house had been the resort of Clifford's followers. And when the White Rose became supreme, that alone of the family possessions had not been forfeited to the crown. It was the last relic of Sir Robert's fortunes. His few tenantry, hard-pressed for rent to satisfy his necessities, had deserted their abodes. The green acres had passed into other hands. A band of poor cotters alone remained, and this old house haunted by the ghosts of those who slept beneath the waveless pool, dilapidated, disfurnished. Yet here the wild knight had held lawless carousals. Hither he sometimes fled to hide after some ruinous loss, or when he was pursued by those who sought to avenge insults committed during drunken brawls. Now it would seem some orgy was meditated. Liveried servants, one or two only bearing Clifford's coat, the rest wearing different badges as belonging to different masters, had arrived during the previous day. Some of the ruined huts were pulled down to supply firewood, and the old chimneys sent out volumes of smoke. Various carts, laden some with eatables, fat bucks, young calves, pheasants, hares, and partridges, piles of bread, 7 whooped casks of wine, were unladen in the mildew-stained hall. Other carts followed the first, bearing bedding, apparel, furniture, and it was whispered by the idling villagers, arms. Several apartments were strewed thick with rushes, and the blazing fires, in spite of the tattered plaster and stained ceilings, imparted cheerfulness to the rooms. There was need of internal warmth. A thick snowstorm fell, sheeting the low fields, which, uninterspersed by trees, now looked doubly wild and drear. The waters of the moat and pool were frozen. A sharp north wind whistled round the house. For the first time for many years its poor dependents were cheered during the severe season by the crumbs, or rather large portions of superfluous food, from the mansion of their landlord. The first guest that arrived came in a close litter, attended by a Moorish servant, and Clifford himself on horseback. Monina had forgotten her Flemish home. Bright Andalusia, its orange groves, myrtle and geranium hedges, the evergreen forests which embowered Alcala, and the fertile laughing Vega of Granada, formed her image of such portions of fair earth as, unencumbered by houses, afforded on its green and various surface sustenance to his inhabitants. She shivered before the northern blast, and gazed appalled on the white plain, where the drifting snow shifted in whole showers as the wind passed over it. The looks of the people, sallow, ill-clothed, and stupid, made her turn from contemplating them, as she yet answered the contemptuous and plaintive remarks of her Spanish attendant in a cheerful, deprecating voice. For 2 successive days other guests continued to arrive. They were chiefly men of note, yet came attended by few domestics. There was Lord Fitzwater, dissatisfied at the part of rebel he was forced, he thought, to play, and on that account he was louder than any against King Henry. Sir Simon Mountford was a Yorkist of the days of Edward IV. He personally hated Richmond, and looked on Richard's as a sacred cause. Sir Thomas Thwaites had been a friend of the Earl of Rivers, and gladly seized this occasion to avenge his death, attributable to the dastardly policy of Henry. William Daubeny was attached to the Earl of Warwick, and entered warmly into projects whose success crowned his freedom. Sir Robert Ratcliffe, cousin of Lord Fitzwater, had lived in poor disguise since the Battle of Stoke, and gladly threw off his peasant's attire to act the soldier again in a new War of the Roses. Sir Richard Lessey had been chaplain to the household of Edward IV. Sir William Worseley, Dean of St. Paul's, was a rare instance of gratitude outliving the period of receiving benefits. He had been a creature, and was a sincere mourner, of the late Queen. Many others, clergy and laity, entered the plot. 1,000 different motives impelled them to one line of conduct, and brought them to Clifford's moated house, to conspire the overthrow of Tudor, and the exaltation of the Duke of York to the throne. One only person invited to this assembly failed. Sir William Stanley. Each voice was loud against his tergiversation, and Clifford's whispered sarcasm cut deeper than all. The debates and consultations lasted 3 days. After infinite confusion and uncertainty, the deliberations brought forth conclusions that were resolved upon unanimously. First, the house they then occupied, and the village, was to be a repository for arms, a rendezvous for the recruits of the cause. The conspirators levied a tax on themselves, and collected some £1,000 to be remitted to the prince. They regulated a system, whose object was to reawaken party spirit in England, and to quicken into speedy growth the seeds of discontent and sedition, which Henry's avarice and extortion had sown throughout the land. Those who possessed estates and followers were to organize troops. At last, they deputed 2 of their number to go over to the Duchess of Burgundy, and to carry their offers of service to her royal nephew. The 2 selected for this purpose were, first, Sir Robert Clifford, who had known the Duke formerly, and who, it was supposed, would be peculiarly welcome to him, and secondly, Master William Barley, a man advanced in years. He had combated in nearly all the 12 pitched and sanguinary battles that were fought between York and Lancaster. He had been a boy servitor to the old Duke of York, a yeoman of Edward's guard, a halberdier in Richard III's time. He had been left for dead on the field of Bosworth, but came to life again to appear at the Battle of Stoke. He had risen in the world, and was a man of substance and reputation. He was not noble, but he was rich, zealous, and honest. The meeting lasted 3 days and then gradually dispersed. All had gone well. An assembly, whose individuals were noble, wealthy, or influential, united to acknowledge Richard as their liege. Foreign potentates declared for him, and hope was high in every bosom at all these forerunners of success. Monina's enthusiastic heart beat with ecstasy. Young, the innocent child of unsophisticated impulse, her gladness showed itself in wild spirits and unconstrained expressions of exultation. She and Clifford returned to London together, for he contrived tacitly and unsuspected by her to install himself as her habitual escort. Happy in expectation of her beloved friend's success, she talked without reserve, and the genius, which was her soul's essence, gave power and fascination to everything she said. She spoke of Spain, of Richard's adventures there, of her father and his voyages. The name of Columbus was mentioned, and the New World, source of wondrous conjecture. They spoke of the desolate waste of waters that hems in the stable earth of the Golden Isles beyond. To all these subjects Monina brought vivid imagery and bright painting, creations of her own quick fancy. Clifford had never before held such discourse. In hours of sickness or distaste, at moments of wild exhilaration, when careering on a high-mettled horse beneath the stars of night, fanned by a strong but balmy wind, he had conceived ideas allied to the lofty aspirations of our nature, but he cast them off as dreams, unworthy of a wise man's attention. The melodious voice of Monina, attuned by the divine impulses of her spirit, as the harp of the winds by celestial breezes, raised a commotion in his mind, such as a prophetess of Delphi felt when the oracular vapor rose up to fill her with sacred fury. A word, a single word, was a potent northern blast to dash aside the mist, and to reapparel the world in its, to him, naked, barren truth. So fervently and so sweetly did she speak of Richard, that Clifford's burning heart was in a moment alight with jealousy, and the love he despised and thought he mastered became his tyrant, when it allied itself to his evil passions. He looked angry, he spoke sharply. Monina was astonished, but his libelous insinuations fell innocuous on her pure mind. She only felt that she feared him, half disliked him, and trembling and laughing as she spoke, said, "Well, well, I will not care for your angry mood. You are going soon. Ere you return, our prince will, by his own bright example, have taught you better things. Learn from him diligently, Sir Knight, for he is all courtesy and nobleness." Clifford laughed bitterly, and a base resolve of lowering the high-hearted York to his own degrading level arose in his breast. It was all chaos there as yet, but the element, which so lately yielded to a regular masterwind of ambition, was tossed in wild and hideous waves by, we will not call the passion love, by jealousy, envy, and growing hate. Short interval was allowed for the gathering of the storm. He was soon called upon to fulfill his commission, and to accompany Master William Barley on their important embassy to Brussels. The scene here presented operated a considerable change on these personages. Arriving from England, where the name of the White Rose was whispered, and every act in his favor was hid in the darkness of skulking conspiracy, to his court at Brussels, where noble followers clustered round him, and the Duchess, with a woman's tact and a woman's zeal, studied how best to give importance and splendor to his person and pretensions. The spirit of the Yorkist party, in spite of her natural mildness, still glowed in the bosom of this daughter of Henry VI's unhappy rival, the child of disaster and bride of frantic turbulence. Opposed to the remorseless Louis XI, struggling with the contentious insolence of the free towns of Flanders, war appeared to her the natural destiny of man, and she yielded to its necessity, while her gentle heart sorrowed over the misery which it occasioned. She first received Clifford and Barley, and with the winning grace of a sovereign, solicited for her nephew their affection and support. Then she presented them to him. This was the fair-haired, blue-eyed boy whom Clifford saved, the gentle, noble-looking being whose simplicity awed him, whose bright smile said, "I reign over every heart." The knight shrunk into himself. How had he dyed his soul in a worldliness which painted his countenance in far other colors? He was not deficient in grace. His dark gray eyes, veiled by long lashes, were in themselves exceedingly handsome. The variableness of his face, traced with many unseasonable lines, yet gave him the power of assuming a pleasing expression. And his person, though diminutive, was eminently elegant, while his self-possession and easy address covered a multitude of faults. Now, his first resolve was to insinuate himself into Richard's affections, to become a favorite, and consequently to lead him blindly on the path he desired he should tread. The prince's spirits were high. His soul exulted in the attachment of others, in the gratitude that animated him. Until Clifford's arrival, Edmund was for the time in England. Sir George Neville, among his new friends, held the first place. He was proud and reserved, but his aristocracy was so blended with honor, his reserve with perfect attention and deference to the feeling of others, that it was impossible not to esteem him and find pleasure in his society. Clifford and Neville made harsh discord together. Richard, inexperienced in the world, sought to harmonize that which never could accord. Neville drew back, and Clifford's good humor and apparent forbearance made him appear to advantage. At this period ambassadors from Henry arrived at Brussels. They had been expected, and as a measure of precaution, Richard left that place before their arrival and took up his temporary abode at Audenarde, a town which made part of the dowry of the Duchess Margaret. All the English, save Lady Brampton, attended him to his retreat. The ambassadors, in their audience with the Archduke, demanded the expulsion of Richard from the Low Countries, taunting the Duchess with her support of the notorious impostor, Lambert Simnel, and speaking of the Duke of York as a fresh puppet of her own making. They received the concise reply: that the gentleman she recognized as her nephew inhabited the territory of her dowry, of which she was sovereign, and over which the Archduke had no jurisdiction. However, that no disturbance might occur in their commercial relations, which would have roused all Flanders to rebellion, Maximilian was obliged to temporize, and to promise to afford no aid to the illustrious exile. Their audience accomplished, the ambassadors had only to return. They remained but one night at Brussels. On this night, Sir Edward Poynings and Dr. Whatham, who fulfilled this mission, were seated over a cup of spiced wine, in discourse concerning these strange events, the Lady Margaret's majestic demeanor, and the strangeness of her supporting this young man, if indeed he were an impostor, when a cavalier, whose soiled dress and heated appearance bespoke fatigue and haste, entered the room. It was Sir Robert Clifford. They received him as liege subjects may receive a traitor, with darkened brows and serious looks. Clifford addressed them in his usual careless style. "St. Thomas shield me, my masters, can you not afford one benison to your gossip? Good Sir Edward, we have ruffled together, when we wore both white and red in our caps, and does the loss of a blood-stained rag degrade me from your friendship?" The bitter accusations of the night, and the doctor's sarcasms which were urged in reply, awoke a haughty smile. "Oh yes," he cried, "ye are true men, faithful liege subjects. I an inheritance of the block, already marked for quartering, because I am for the weak right, you for the strong might. Right I say, start not, the mother of God be my witness. Duke Richard, is lord of us all, true son of the true king, Ned of the White Rose, whom you swore to protect, cherish, and exalt. You, yes, even you, Sir Knight. Where is now your oath, cast from heaven, to pave the hell where you will reap the meed of your lying treachery?" Clifford, always insolent, was doubly so now that he felt accused of crimes of which he did not deem himself guilty, but which would, so an obscure presentiment told him, hereafter stain his soul. Dr. Whatham interposed before Poynings' rising indignation. "Wherefore come you here, Sir Robert?" he asked. "Though we are envoys of the king you have betrayed, we may claim respect. Sir Edward, as a gentleman and a cavalier, I as an humble servitor of the Lord Jesus, in whose name I command you not to provoke to a bloody deed the messengers of peace." "Cease to taunt me with a traitor's name," replied Sir Robert, "and I will chafe no further the kindling blood of my sometime friend. Let us rather leave all idle recrimination. I came hither to learn how wagged the world in London town, and as a piece of secret intelligence, to assure you that you wrongfully brand this stripling for an impostor. Be he sovereign of our land or not, be it right or wrong to side with York against Lancaster, York he is, the son of Edward and Elizabeth, so never fail me my good sword or my ready wits. The best of us are inclined to curiosity. A little fearful of each other, the ambassadors exchanged looks, to know whether either would accuse the other of treachery if they heard further. "Good sir," said the doctor, gravely, "methinks we do our liege service in listening to this gentleman. We can the better report to his majesty on what grounds the diabolic machination is founded." So, over another goblet, Clifford sat telling them how Richard had long lived as Perkin Warbeck in the neighborhood of Tournay, under the guardianship of Madeleine de Ferrot, and he recounted the history of his escape from the hands of Frion. Dr. Whatham carefully conned these names, and then, in reply, he set forth how unworthy it was of a Clifford to desert from Lancaster. How unlikely, even if it were true, which, after all his tale hardly proved it was, that the outcast boy could compete with success with the sage possessor of England's throne. Poynings asked him how it pleased him to find himself at the same board with a Neville and a Taylor, and hinted that an exile from his country and a traitor to his sovereign, this was hardly the way to replenish his purse, or to gain anew the broad lands he had lost. The service he might do Henry by a return to his duty, gratitude, and reward, were then urged by the priest, while Clifford listened in dogged silence. His brow became flushed, his lips worked with internal commotion. He felt he knew that he hated the very man whose cause he espoused, but he was pledged to so many, a whole array of noble and respected names came before him. Could he, in the eyes of these, become a false foul traitor? He refilled and quaffed again and again his cup, and at last so wound himself up as to begin, "My friends, you speak sooth, though I may not listen, yet if you name one so humble and distasteful, say to my liege." A page in green and white, the colors of Lady Brampton, entered, announcing her speedy arrival. Clifford's wits were already disturbed by wine. Instinct made him fear in such a state to come in contact with the subtle lady. He drew his cap over his eyes, his cloak around his person, and vanished from the hall, ere his friends were aware of his intention. The interview between Lady Brampton and the gentleman was of another sort. Sir Edward had in her younger days worn her colors. She was changed in person since then. But when, after a short interval, he got over the shock consequent on the first perception of the sad traces of time on the cheek of beauty, he found that her eyes possessed the same fire, her voice the same thrilling tone, her smile the same enchantment. While the doctor, who had loved her as a daughter, and she regarded him with filial reverence, rebuked her for what he termed her misdeeds, she replied with vivacity, and such true and zealous love for him whose cause she upheld, that they were both moved to listen with respect, if not conviction, to her asseverations. She could not gain her point, nor win them over to her side, but when she departed, neither spoke of young Richard's rights, unwilling to confess to one another that they were converts to his truth. She went. The next day they departed from Brussels, and it became subject of discussion what step Henry would now take, and whether, by any new measure, he could disturb the ripening conspiracy against his throne. Chapter 21. Treason. Oh, what excuse can my invention make? I do arrest ye of high treason here. Shakespeare. Henry's ambassadors had wrought little change on any except Clifford. His words had been interrupted, they were nothing in themselves, but their spirit, the spirit of treason, was in his heart. He made up his mind to nothing, he looked forward to no certain project, but he felt that hereafter he might betray his present associates to their arch-enemy. As yet his conscience was not seared, the very anticipation of guilt tortured him, and he longed to fly from thought. Another blind impulse drove him on. He hated the prince because he was his opposite. Because, while he was a cankered bloom, his heart a waste, his soul crusted over by deceit, his very person sullied by evil deeds and thoughts, Duke Richard stood in all the pride of innocence. Could he degrade him to his own level, there would be a pang the less in his bosom. Could he injure him in the eyes of his friends, render him, as he himself had ever been, an object of censure, he would satisfy the ill cravings of his nature, and do Henry a wondrous benefit by tarnishing the high character his rival bore, causing him whom his adherents set up as an idol, to become a reproach to them. Clifford thought that it would be an easy task to entice a gay young stripling into vice. Richard loved hawking, hunting, and jousting in the lists, almost more, some of his elder friends thought, than befitted one on the eve of a perilous enterprise. Governed by Edmund, attended by Neville, watched by the noble Duchess and vigilant Lady Brampton, it was no great wonder that he had hitherto escaped error. But Clifford went wilily to work, and hoped in some brief luckless hour to undo the work of years. Richard was glad to find in him a defender of his inclination for manly sports. An intimacy sprung up between them, which it would not be the knight's fault, if it did not bring about the catastrophe he desired. What then perpetually opposed all his measures? What, when he thought he had caused the tide of temptation to flow, suddenly made it ebb and retreat back to its former banks? Clifford, an adept in every art, molded himself to every needful form, and at last won the secret from the deep recess of Richard's heart. He loved Monina, that living emblem of innocent affection. Never, he had vowed, would he disturb the sacred calm that reigned in her young heart, nor gift ignorance with fatal knowledge. She knew not the nature of her own feelings, and he would not withdraw the veil, but he was himself conscious of being swayed by the tenderest love. He could not marry her, his own misfortunes had arisen from the misalliance of his father. She herself would have refused to injure thus his cause, and have disdained him, if for her sake he had been inclined to abdicate his rights. He would be her friend, her brother. With passion came sorrow. He fled from sad reflection to the chase, to the exercise of arms. But other temptation became blunted by this very sentiment. His love grew more ardent by restraint. If he yielded in her absence to the contemplation of her image, his soul was filled with a voluptuous languor, from which he roused himself by attention to his duties or hardy pastimes, but to every other form of pleasure he was cold. This was a strange, incomprehensible picture to present to the world-worn Clifford. He fancied that it must be a delusion, but he found all the resistance of firm reality. To embitter his defeat came his own fierce passions, and the knowledge that Monina loved his rival. They would see each other, be happy in each other, and laugh him to scorn. He concealed his jealousy, his disappointment, but double-treble rage gnawed at his heart. Hatred awoke in her most viperous shape, fanged by a sense of inferiority, envenomed by envy, sharpened by the torture of defeat. How little did any know above all, how not at all did his innocent victim suspect, the storm that brooded in his heart. There was something in the very slightness and grace of his figure that was at variance with the idea of violence and crime, and his glossing tongue added to the deceit. Lady Brampton feared him a little. Frion saw something in him, that made him pay greater court to him than to any other, these were the only indications. Sunshine and calm brooded over the earthquake's birth. Meanwhile, Henry was not sleeping at his post. He saw the full extent of his danger and exerted all his energy to provide against it. His immediate attention was chiefly directed to 2 points. In the first place, it was desirable to forge some tale, to account for the circumstances that spoke so loudly for the truth of York's story, and thus to degrade him from the high esteem in which he was universally held. Secondly, it became necessary to certify to the public the death of Edward V and his brother in the Tower. We may well wonder at his ill success as to the first point. There never was concocted so ill-fangled, so incongruous, and so contradictory a fable as that put together by Henry, purporting to be the history of the Pretender. He was himself ashamed of it, and tried to call it in. History has in its caprice given more credence to this composition than its contemporaries gave. It was ridiculed and despised at the time even by the partisans of Lancaster. He was equally unfortunate in his second effort. To explain his attempts we must go back to the time of Richard III. On repeated reports being made to him of his unhappy imprisoned nephew's illness, this monarch had commissioned Sir James Tyrrell to visit him. The young prince had languished without any appearance of immediate danger, and then suddenly drooped even to the grave. Tyrrell arrived at the Tower late in the evening, and the first intelligence he received was that the Lord Edward was dying. At the midnight hour he was admitted into his sick room. His 2 attendants followed him no further than the antechamber. He entered. The glazed eye and death-pale cheek of the victim spoke of instant dissolution. A few slight convulsions, and it was over. Edward was no more. With wild, loud cries poor little York threw himself on his brother's body. Tyrrell's servants, affrighted, entered. They found one of the princes, whose illness had been represented as trivial, dead. The other was carried off, struggling and screaming, by their master and an attendant priest, the only 2 persons in the chamber. They departed 2 hours afterwards from the Tower. Tyrrell seemed disturbed and was silent. They would perhaps have thought less about it, but hearing subsequently of the disappearance and supposed death of the young duke, wonder grew into suspicion, and in thoughtless talk they laid the foundation of a dire tale out of these fragments. Henry had heard it before. Now he endeavored to trace its origin. Tyrrell, who for some time had lived obscurely in the country, came to London. He was immediately seized and thrown into prison. Emissaries were set to work to find the 3 others, the priest and Sir James's 2 servants. Only one was to be found, and when Tyrrell was asked concerning this man by name John Dighton, he told a tale of ingratitude punished by him, which was soothing sweet to King Henry's ear. He was speedily discovered and imprisoned. Both master and follower underwent many examinations, and it was suggested to each that reward would follow their giving countenance to a tale of midnight murder. Tyrrell was indignant at the proposal. Dighton, on the contrary, a needy, bad man, while he told the story so as to gloss his own conduct, was very ready to inculpate his master, and it grew finely under his fosterage. Henry saw that without Tyrrell's connivance he could not authenticate any account, but he gave all the weight he could to these reports. Few persons believed them, yet it served to confuse and complicate events, and while people argued, some at least would take his side of the question, and these would be interested to spread their belief abroad. Duke Richard must be the loser in every way. The spies, the traitor emissaries of the fear-struck monarch, were all busy. There was a whole army of them dispersed in England and Flanders. None could know the false man from the true. To obviate every suspicion, he caused his own hirelings to be proclaimed traitors and cursed at St. Paul's Cross. The priests, ever his friends, were impiously permitted to violate the sacrament of confession, and thus several unsuspecting men betrayed their lives, while they fancied that they performed a religious duty. A few names still escaped him. He tampered with Clifford and Frion for them. The former was not yet quite a villain. The latter found that he enjoyed more credit, honor, and power as the Duke's secretary than he could do as Henry's spy. Besides, his vanity was hurt. He wished to revenge himself on the master who had discarded him. In nothing did Henry succeed better than in throwing an impenetrable veil over his maneuvers. Most people thought, so tranquil and unconcerned he seemed, that he did not suspect the existence of an actual conspiracy, fostered in England itself, containing many influential persons among its numbers. All were sure that he was entirely ignorant of their names and actual purposes. The many months which intervened while he waited patiently corroborated this belief, and the conspirators slept in security. The winter passed, and they continued to scheme, apparently unobserved. Spring came, they prepared for York's landing, for a general rising, for a sudden seizing on many walled towns and fortresses, for the occupation of London itself. A few brief weeks, and Henry's prosperity would be shaken to its center. His power uprooted, he and his children would wander exiles in a foreign land. And another king, the gallant descendant of the true Plantagenets, reign in his stead. Thus occupied, thus prepared, were the Yorkists in England. At Brussels, things were carried on more openly, and wore a more promising appearance. The Duchess, Lady Brampton, Plantagenet, triumphed. Sir George Neville anticipated with proud joy a restoration of the fallen race of Warwick, and regarded himself already as another kingmaker of that house. Every exile looked northward, and grew joyful with the thought of home. Frion became more busy and important than ever. He had lately gone disguised to England, in pursuance of some project. In another week they expected Lord Barry to join them from Ireland. Clifford was amazed, vacillating, terrified. He knew that Henry was far from idle. He was aware that some of the loudest speakers in Richard's favor in Brussels were his hirelings, whom he would not betray, because he half felt himself one among them, though he could not quite prevail on himself to join their ranks. He believed that the king was in eager expectation of his decision in his favor, that nothing could be done till he said the word. He proposed conditions, wished to conceal some names, exempt others from punishment. Messengers passed continually between him and Bishop Morton, Henry's chief counselor and friend, and yet he could not determine to be altogether a traitor. Thus stood affairs, a consummation all thought to be nigh at hand. It was the spring of 1494, and the coming summer was to decide the fate of York. A ball was given by the Duchess, in honor of her nephew. It was splendidly and gaily attended. Clifford had been conversing with the prince, when suddenly he left the apartment. It was long ere he came back, and slowly joined the principal group in the room, consisting of the Duchess, the prince, Lady Brampton, Neville, Plantagenet, Taylor, and several others. Clifford's countenance was marked by horror and surprise, so much so that Lady Brampton looked at him a moment without knowing him. Suddenly she started up and seized his arm. "Holy Virgin!" she cried. "What had dressed your face, Sir Robert, in this pale livery? What tale of death have you heard?" The brow of Clifford became flushed, his lips grew whiter, as quivering they refused to form the words he attempted to utter. Barley had before this quitted the apartment. He rushed in now, crying aloud, "Treason!" "Treason," Neville repeated, laying his hand heavily on Clifford's shoulder. "Hear you that word, Sir Knight? Where is the traitor?" Clifford in a moment recovered himself, answering composedly, "I would I could point out the man, would that I could drag him forth, the mark, the very target for the shafts of vengeance. We are lost, the cause is lost, our friends, the good Lord Fitzwater. I would have hid his name in the bowels of the earth." Already the festal hall was deserted. Already the guests were dispersed, to learn how wide the destruction had spread. By the prince's orders, the messenger from England was introduced before himself and his principal friends. It was Adam Floyer, Sir Simon Mountford's chaplain, escaped himself. He was the bearer of a frightful tale. On one day, almost at the same hour, the Yorkist conspirators were arrested. Lord Fitzwater, Sir Simon Mountford, Sir Thomas Thwaites, Robert Ratcliffe, William Daubeny, Thomas Cressener, Thomas Estwood, two Dominicans, by name William Richford and Thomas Poins, Dr. William Sutton, Worsley the Dean of St. Paul's, Robert Langbourne and Sir William Lessey, were all seized and cast into prison. Others had escaped. Young Gilbert Daubeny, brother of William, and Sir Edward Lisle, had arrived in Flanders. Others made good speed and had fled to Ireland. Chapter 22. Herman de Faro. O Clifford, but bethink thee once again, and in thy thought o'errun my former time. And if thou canst for blushing, view this face. Shakespeare. Where is the traitor? Neville's question resounded through Flanders, and was re-echoed in groans from the English shores. Each man feared the other, and saw the mark of Henry's malice on the brow of all. It was a worse scene in England. Executions followed imprisonment, the scaffolds flowed with blood, and suspicion was still greedy of prey. Among the papers seized by the king there was found a letter from Clifford to Lord Fitzwater, containing these words: "I do protest, my lord, that the proof of York's truth is most pertinent. You know this, and yet he who cut the crooked rosebush to the roots still doubts. Forsooth, he is still at his ifs. If he were sure that young man were King Edward's son, he would never bear arms against him. Pray deprive my lord of his if, for arms he must never bear, he is too principal to any cause." Henry tormented himself to find who this doubter might be. Again he sought to bribe Clifford, who was at first dogged that so much was done without him, and then tried to barter his intelligence for Lord Fitzwater's life. Such grace had he left, that he was ready to exert his wits to save his former patron. This was granted. This noble alone of the conspirators who were laymen was spared. He was sent prisoner to Calais. At the first word of discovery, Monina's friends had endeavored to ensure her escape to Flanders, but her name was known to Henry, and there was none whom he was more desirous to get into his power. She remained concealed at a little distance from London. She grew mad in inaction. The work of death and misery around wound up her tender spirit to torture, and the execution of her former friends filled her with such horror as made day hateful, night the parent of frightful visions. After several weeks' seclusion, she all at once resolved to visit London, to seek some one of her former friends, to learn whether the tragedy was over, and what further mischiefs despair might have engendered. She inhabited a solitary mansion, with one old woman, who opposed her going, but vainly. Monina was too young to bear uncertainty with any degree of patience. Some slight joy visited her as she found herself on her road to London. Before she arrived a heavy rain fell, but she was not to be discouraged. Sir Edward Lisle, she knew, had not been arrested. She was unaware of his escape, and thought perhaps that he had not been discovered. She might get intelligence from him. His house was deserted and empty. Another hope remained, Sir William Stanley. She knew his timidity and resolved to be cautious as to the manner of her visit. Sir William had ever been peculiarly kind to the gentle maiden. Fearing to see her openly, she had often come to him by water. His mansion, near the palace at Westminster, had a garden upon the Thames. Without exciting any remark, she could land here. It was already night, and this favored secrecy. With some difficulty, in the city where she then was, she contrived to find her way to an obscure wharf, and embarked in a wherry. Fortunately it was high water, and she landed without difficulty in the garden and dismissed the men. Now she began to be puzzled as to how she should make her way, dripping with rain, unexpected, to Sir William's presence. She had been accustomed to be admitted by a little door opening on stairs which led her to her old friend's library. This was shut now. Suddenly she thought she heard voices, and then perceived a thread of light that streamed through the keyhole of the summer-house in the garden. There was a noise on the water, too, and a boat was paddled to the landing place. Bewildered, yet believing that all this secrecy was connected with the grand conspiracy, she moved towards the summer-house. The door was opened, and the light falling full upon her, she saw several figures within, and a female shriek burst upon her ear. Quick steps were heard behind. To retreat or go forward equally terrified her, when one of the persons in the summer-house, a man in an uncouth foreign garb, cried, "Thou here, Monina? What miracle is this? Come, come in, there is danger in all we do." Monina recognized the voice of Frion and entered. There she saw one, a lady richly attired, yet half disguised in a large black cloak. Fear was painted on her cheek, her blue eyes were cast up to heaven. A female attendant with her seemed yet more terrified. About the room were scattered globes and astrolabes and all the gear of an astrologer. In the lady, Monina recognized York's sister, Tudor's queen, the fair Elizabeth of England. At once compassion and respect entered her heart. She addressed the royal lady with reverence, and all that touching grace that was her sweetest charm. She assured her of inviolable secrecy. She reminded her of their former interview. Elizabeth grew calmer as she recognized her visitor at Sheen. She stretched out her hand to the Spaniard, saying, "I do indeed believe and trust thee, thou shalt hear again from me." Then folding her mantle round her, and leaning on her attendant, she quitted the house, and with trembling haste embarked.